Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here today, and today we are going to be looking at a subject that ought to be studied more. It's known somewhat, but definitely for us here in the Midwest, we should be aware of, and that is the reincarnation of the KKK in the 1920s. So on this happy topic, let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be looking for the reasons why the KKK gets restarted in the 1920s, and then also we're going to summarize what was it actually capable of doing on the ground. What was its influence in the Midwest? Okay, two kind of big things we want to think about here. How do hate groups represent or magnify the concerns of a society? So, what's often said about groups like the KKK or, for example, like other white supremacist kind of organizations in the United States today is they're a minority, but they're often called a vocal minority. However, does that minority have to do with anything of like underlying sentiments that are felt by a larger part of the population, or are they completely unrelated? Also, okay, how do politics, race, and ethnicity affect decisions and policies made by local people and governments? And definitely you're going to see how the KKK has a role to play in that. Okay, so why does it get reborn? Well, you need to make sure you understand the context of the 1920s, and it's the reason why I have my students just before this video do an activity in where they talk about all the changes going on since 1865, since the Civil War. We've had massive numbers of immigrants from especially South and Eastern European countries. These are places that are quite culturally different than what had been immigrating, or people that have been immigrating to the United States before. So again, yes, some Germans, but now we're talking about Slavs, Poles, Russians, etc. Okay, so that's been happening. Second, the Great Migration. And we now have hundreds of thousands of black Americans over the 1920s, 30s, 40s who are migrating to Midwestern cities. And for WASPs, that is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans who had been in the North for this entire time, they increasingly begin to feel this need to protect Americanism from otherness. Okay, now we often call the desire for a group of people to kind of get rid of immigrant influence, or to kind of keep a pure culture, we call this nativism, or sometimes xenophobia, fear of others, or fear of otherness. Okay, and you're definitely going to see that's how that's happening here in the North, as now times are changing. The United States is looking a lot different than it had just even 50 years beforehand. Okay, so who restarted the KKK and what was it? I'm going to let you guys click this video. Study.com is putting together a really good introduction video on them. I'd like you to go ahead and summarize it in 3 hashtags. Okay, I'll go ahead and give you some time to go ahead and do that. Okay, so what is the new, or what are going to be the new ideals of the reborn KKK? Number one, it's going to talk about 100% Americanism. Now, again, we're defining Americanism here as kind of this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethic that we're going not necessarily back to a kind of a glory days, but certainly kind of trying to purify this particular vision, or create this particular vision of America that these people had. They're also, therefore, this means that you are going to try to lessen the power of these others who have come in since. So Jews, blacks, Catholics, because again, Catholics had not been a tolerated part of the United States. Again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? And then also massive numbers of immigrants. Okay, and the way that they're going to do this, okay, these ideals, is they're going to basically do a couple of things. Number one, there's going to be pressure at the local and even like the personal kind of like neighborly level. And then number two is they're going to raise and elect Klan-backed politicians and other kind of folks in government to make sure that they can influence local, statewide, and in some cases even national laws. Okay, so really you can see this here. So the founder of the KKK, his name was William J. Simmons. You've heard of him in that video you just watched. This was his warning about the melting pot of the United States, so about all the immigrants coming in. He says, quote, "It's a garbage can. When the hordes of aliens walk to the ballot box and their votes outnumber yours, then that alien horde has got you by the throat." And that is indeed the attitude that the KKK is going to have. And if we look here at the numbers, Okay, so here's our numbers: 1871, 1920, then all of a sudden, 1925, it skyrockets up to 5 million members. That's estimated. It becomes immensely, immensely popular, and it is especially in the Midwest, in cities such as Indianapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. And there's some really interesting information here. There's a historian called Kevin Boyle, and I'm going to read this selection that he has on Detroit here in particular. He's talking about the KKK located there. And I'm going to kind of skip through this because it's a bit lengthy. So this is talking about the Klan in Detroit. Okay, so the first Klan organizer there, just as the organization was trying to push its base into the urban north. So this guy, his name was Murphy. Okay, he spent the next year spreading the carefully crafted message of moral renewal, 100% Americanism, anti-unionism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, that's anti-Jew, okay, and racism. A more overt, cruder version of the politics that the Detroit News had vainly employed against Murphy. Okay, so anyway, skip that part. So great was the reception, the Klan could barely keep up with the flow of recruits. By 1923, there were 22,000 Klansmen in Detroit, and the Invisible Order was ready to go public. Throughout that summer, the KKK held nighttime rallies on the far west side, complete with cross burning so spectacular and speeches so incendiary they drew upward of 8,000. Klan newsboys took to selling the organization's newspaper, The Fiery Cross, on street corners. And on Christmas Eve in 1923, Klansmen marked the season by burning a 6-foot-tall cross in front of City Hall, then cheering a hooded Santa Claus come to entertain the kids. So this is how public it is. They're doing this right in front of the City Hall in Detroit. It's a vastly different world than even now what we're kind of familiar with. And if we look here at the, this is from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Hooded Order. If we look at the membership here, there is something difficult about how many members we can determine that were part of the KKK, even when it became so popular. And so, what do you think it's going to make things difficult? What is going to make things difficult for historians to try to determine the amount of members that are a part of this organization? I'll give you a moment to think on it. Okay, so if you look here, okay, so the answer, and this is only revealed if you click, Klan membership numbers have always been inexact because of the clandestine nature, the secret nature of the organization. Furthermore, active involvement in the Klan only tells a part of the story. These figures do not include the vast numbers of sympathizers who may have read white supremacist literature and attended rallies, but who weren't official members. And this is a really good point, because the KKK in the North is not just like the people who actually join the KKK. It's all the people who are influenced by their ideas too. And even though they're not official members, they may buy into certain parts of the ideology or the philosophy that comes out of the Klan, and they also may do some very similar things as the Klan, even though they're not members. And the other thing that also makes this really difficult to determine is that people once, and especially once the Civil Rights Movement happens, is that after that kind of really takes hold, people don't want to be found out to have been Klan members, and so they burn or get rid of a lot of these sources. So what's the impact of the Klan on people in the North? Let's give some more direct examples here. They are insanely good at getting local officials elected and raising money, but I would argue that the more indirect impacts, so besides those things, is what they do on the ground that's even more impactful. Okay, so again, they may just be inspired by nativist feelings. It might include the KKK, but it's kind of this whole ethic that's going on that's been kind of pushed by them, and kind of other people are following. So right here, the first thing, the creation of urban ghettos. So what happens in the 1920s and as society in the United States starts to get more developed, especially in terms of urban areas, is we have a policy called redlining. Okay, and realtors, neighbors, and even neighborhood associations were very good about writing in statutes and other kind of rules in their kind of neighborhood association contracts and those kind of things that would keep these others out of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant neighborhoods. Sometimes there would be economic barriers, other times there would just be straight up intimidation to keep them out of these places. But I'm going to give you one other example, and that's called redlining. Okay, so what redlining is that the United States had a policy of, and this was done by both state and local realtors and officials and other members of government, is that appraisers and these cities officials would go out and they would kind of map the city as it's beginning to be planned, and they would designate certain neighborhoods of the city as bad or rough, and then they would mark these with a red line on these maps, and that's how we get the name redlining. Now, by rough or bad, usually they would, for instance, mean that these were black. Okay, so in Indianapolis specifically, since that's more relevant to our local context, this is the section of Indianapolis that's now Indiana Avenue. And what they would do then, by redlining these areas, is that it would be very, very hard for black businesses in the area, or black homeowners, to be able to move to either outside of these redlined areas, or it would be very difficult for them to even acquire wealth over time, because again, like something that's big when you go and buy a house is that you can take that wealth that you've established and you can sell off that equity and then go and buy and do other things. And so this policy makes it incredibly difficult for families to get loans, start businesses, etc. And Adam Ruins Everything, which is a TV show on True TV, has done a really good episode on this, and we're going to watch it in class, so you can click right here to access that. Okay. Also, okay, what is the other impacts? Police brutality. Policemen also do become members of the KKK in some cases, and there's oftentimes few to no repercussions when they go to areas like Black Bottom, which is one of these urban ghettos in Detroit, and it's, as it says, brutal. There's mobs and race riots pretty consistently throughout the early 19th century and up through the 20th. Through the end of the 20th, and this is in some cases with blacks retaliating to what whites had done to them. In some cases, it's just whites, becoming embroiled over a certain neighbor that might have moved in, or a certain number of other events that might have happened in the city at the time. It's quite harsh. Okay, so. What I'd like you to do now is finish your exit ticket on Go Pollock, but I hope this has been helpful in terms of understanding the rebirth of the KKK, and then also how it affected life on the ground for many of these blacks, Jews, Catholics, these new others who have moved into the North since the end of the Civil War.